Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 171 of the Fcpa Compliance and Ethics Report. The Fcpa Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions. Today I take a look at Fcpa enforcement in the energy industry and in the city of Houston, Texas, which is the epicenter of Fcpa enforcement in the world. I take a look at some of the reasons for this enforcement and some of the business solutions that companies in the energy space have come up with. I think you will find this very interesting in terms of the lessons learned from DOJ, enforcement in the DOJ perspective, but also the business solutions to this very difficult legal problem. The episode comes in at just over 18 minutes. I thank you very much for listening. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the Fcpa Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I'm coming to you from sunny but cool and dry San Diego, California, where I'm out here doing some work. It's certainly cooler than Houston and the humidity is much less, so I found it to be very pleasant, although apparently the locals think it's hot and humid out here, so I guess it all depends on your perspective. Coming from Houston, Texas, one of the things about Fcpa enforcement is that most energy companies in Houston have gone through either an Fcpa enforcement action or an Fcpa investigation. This has led to the energy industry being certainly the industry with the most Fcpa enforcement actions involving it. But more importantly, from where I sit, Houston, Texas is the Fcpa enforcement epicenter of the world. More Houston-based companies, either legal or operationally based, in Houston have gone through either Fcpa enforcement actions or Fcpa investigations than any other city in the world. This has given Houston a couple of unique perspectives on the Fcpa. One is obviously the cost involved, but the second is the maturity and of corporate compliance programs and the amount of compliance talent available in Houston because of this. There are lots of lessons, I think, to be learned for other industries and for the compliance practitioner and chief compliance officer in general. So I really wanted to explore in depth why the energy industry has come to this crossroad, what led to the Department of Justice enforcing the Fcpa against the energy industry, and what lessons that you might be able to take away from this. So with that, it's interesting to note that as of today even, 4 of the top 10 Fcpa fines of all time revolve around companies or Fcpa incidents for companies headquartered in Houston. 5 of the top 10 Fcpa fines of all time are energy companies, even to this day. So energy has played a big part in Fcpa enforcement, and the reasons, it may be circumstances, it may be happenstance, it may be several other factors, but it really all revolves around a company called Vetco Gray. And Vetco Gray no longer exists. It was acquired by General Electric in 2008, I believe, or 2007. But Vetco Gray in 2001 was involved in an Fcpa matter. And then in 2004, they had a subsequent Fcpa matter. And the Department of Justice, on the second go-around for Vetco Gray, it involved the shipment of goods into Nigeria, where the shipping company, Panalpina, the Swiss shipper, freight forwarder, was bribing government officials in Nigeria to get equipment for Vetco Gray into Nigeria. And they were doing it pretty blatantly. It was flat fee billing for the bribes. I believe it was $25,000 per cargo shipment, a plane full of cargo. Nevertheless, someone at the Department of Justice got the bright idea that if Panalpina was doing this for Vetco Gray, perhaps they were doing this for someone else. And it turned out that was true. and Panalpina was doing it for a large number of energy companies, and unfortunately energy companies based in Houston. So the Vetco Gray Fcpa enforcement action led to Panalpina. And once the Department of Justice got to the freight forwarder and got the customer list of Panalpina, that led to our infamous or famous Panalpina Settlement Day, where I think 7 other companies besides Panalpina settled on or around the same day that Panalpina settled their Fcpa enforcement action. So we had Shell settling for $81 million, Noble Energy for $8 million, Tidewater for $15 million, Pride International for $56 million, Transocean for $20 million. We had Global Marine settling. We had Global Industries got a declination to prosecute, all out of the Panalpina case. So the Department of Justice really had the model in place to find out about other energy companies. And of course, other energy companies have been involved. Halliburton is still number 3 on the all-time list of Fcpa fines and penalties for the Nigerian gas plant with their subsidiary KBR, and there were 3 other, or I should say several other prosecutions around that case. So every company, every large company has gone through this in Houston. But one of the interesting results of this is that you have a lot of compliance talent in these companies, and you have had what I call business solutions to the legal problem of the Fcpa. And what I mean by this is that all of the companies who have gone through Fcpa enforcement actions, of course, have very robust compliance programs. They had to as part of their settlement. So, for instance, Parker Drilling, which was also a fallout of the Panalpina case, put together a best practices compliance program. Well, if you're a subcontractor now and you want to do business with Parker Drilling, you have to have an Fcpa compliance program. So obviously the majors, the major oil companies, Exxon, Shell, Chevron, they all have compliance programs. And the next level, called the service companies who do work for them, also have compliance programs. So Halliburton, Schlumberger, Baker Hughes, Weatherford, all of whom have gone through enforcement actions and or investigations. They have robust compliance programs in place. But if you want to do business with any of those companies, really in any way, you have to have a compliance program in place. So from the major multi-billion-dollar corporation that wants to do business with Halliburton, down to the $15 million software company that has a tool that does something that bolts on to a piece of software for one of the service companies, that $15 million software company also has to have an Fcpa compliance program. The reason, it's because these major corporations want to assure themselves that their counterparties are not going to get them in Fcpa hot water. So if you're an agent or a representative, if you're a distributor, if you're a vendor in the supply chain, if you're a subcontractor, if you're a business partner, if you're a joint venture partner, if you're a bidding partner, it really doesn't matter. You have to have a compliance program in place. Scott Killingsworth, of course, calls this private to private, and he talks about the contractual requirements and the codes of conduct obligations that go back and forth across businesses. Nevertheless, from other industries, the clear import of this is that you can make a change and you can make a difference. And from the enforcement perspective, I think the Department of Justice got the model, obviously, for enforcement when they went after Panalpina, because then they got the customer list. But what they have done is then in other industries, they have found one case which sort of unlocks the model for them. Now, in the pharmaceutical space, which we'll take a look at a later episode, we had Johnson & Johnson was really the first case. And there, it was a little bit different because buried in the in the Deferred Prosecution Agreement was information that the Department of Justice, that Johnson & Johnson was cooperating with an ongoing basis. And this may have meant that they were talking about how they were doing distribution models and distribution networks and how their competitors were. Then in the tech space, of course, we had HP, Hewlett-Packard in 2014. And there, it wasn't so much that I think the department learned about the different methods to fund bribes, of which, of course, HP had 3 different bribery schemes in place, or rather, I should say, funding mechanisms for their bribery schemes. But it was that the use of agents to bundle up bids for hardware and software for large purchasers, government entities or state-owned enterprises outside the United States. So from the Department of Justice perspective, I think the DOJ has learned to find that common connection and then use that as a way to open the door to see what other companies may be engaging in the same and similar conduct. And they started that in the energy space. The response by the energy companies, I think, has been equally interesting and more importantly, something that any other industry or business can learn, which is that you can work together either directly in a trade organization, informally, or in some other mechanism by which to have a business solution to the legal problem of Fcpa compliance. It's well known in the energy industry, if you want to have a contract, you're going to have a compliance program in place. And most compliance practitioners know each other formally or informally, either through attending conferences, trade groups, or the simple fact that if my little $15 million software client wants to do business with one of the big boys, someone from the big boys compliance program is going to call and ask for the documents around the third-party agents, sales agents, and the management of those sales agents and the due diligence of those sales agents. And that person is going to call me at some point, and they're going to want to review the files. And I've had plenty of other chief compliance officers tell me that a compliance practitioner from another company has come and audited their compliance program prior to the signing of a contract. So this has really driven down compliance, and it's made it so that everyone understands what their obligations are and everyone can generally move forward. If there is an agent or third party in a country that engages in a violation, that information can also be readily disseminated. I recognize that the Department of Justice Antitrust Division certainly takes a different view of or about when competitors might share information, but in the compliance realm, I don't think this is something that is negatively thought of at the DOJ. And indeed, I think the Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission and the Fcpa guidance talked about having trade associations and industry groups being a part of the solution. Part of that solution can be working outside the United States to set up different means and methods by which third parties can be cleared, can be trained, and can generally put compliance programs in place which will satisfy the Fcpa. And once again, because of the unique perspective of the energy industry due to the heavy enforcement, I think this is something that has happened on a more regular basis. The other interesting thing about particularly Houston and energy being the epicenter of Fcpa enforcement in the world is that at the board level, there is quite a bit of knowledge of the Fcpa. So if in every board there is one of the following: someone who has gone through an FCPA enforcement action as a board member, someone whose company has gone through an FCPA enforcement action, someone who sat on the board of another company that went through an FCPA enforcement action. So it reinforces itself at the board level. So interestingly, in addition to having the compliance talent, not only in the trenches, but at the chief compliance officer level, there's also a lot of compliance knowledge and indeed talent at the board level. And this is something we don't typically see in other industries because we haven't had that wave of enforcement, save perhaps pharmaceutical and tech. So really up and down the chain, we have lots of compliance, we have lots of compliance talent, we have lots of compliance programs, we have lots of compliance training. Almost every employee of an energy company has gone through one or more FCPA and or compliance training sessions, so they're aware of the FCPA. The countries where bribes are, there's a high perception of bribery and corruption, those countries are pretty well known, and I think the folks that have to travel to those countries are aware of that. Expats are, in many for instance, West African countries, expats are kind of kept together in a compound, so that's something that is shared, information that's shared and discussion. But even in relatively open societies such as Dubai, there's an expat community that does get together on a regular basis, and those kinds of things, that kind of information is shared. So even though we have had significant FCPA enforcement actions in the energy space, this has led to significant FCPA compliance in the energy space. So the takeaways, I think, are that once the Department of Justice gets to a company which opens the door and shows it the model for enforcement, you can see sort of an explosion of enforcement across an industry. But from the compliance practitioner perspective, the response by the energy industry has been one which I would advocate be emulated across many other industries, which is to drive compliance down the supply chain. The more companies that you have doing compliance, the more robust the overall compliance program is, and the better to certainly detect, but even prevent or prescribe bribery going forward. And then, of course, on a remedial basis, if you have other companies looking at your compliance program, either through auditing, ongoing monitoring, or some other mechanism, you have the ability to self-correct or correct in mid-course, which you don't typically have. So the energy industry presents lots of lessons learned, some things not to do, but many things that you should do and you can emulate. And I think the Department of Justice's focus led this industry to really having to develop a business response to a very difficult legal solution going forward. So this concludes this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, I hope you will contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com, because I'm trying to have another mailbag issue. Also, if I could ask you to go to iTunes